All right. Well, it looks like it's just around 12:10, so we'll get going. Thanks everyone for joining us. Looks like we're having a great turnout today. I really appreciate that. So to start, I'd just like to welcome you to our research conversations for the spring. And I want to shout out to Laura Girardeau and A.G. Rudd for helping me put this together and finding our speakers. It's really been a pleasure to hear people fall into this spring of their talks and their research and the conversations we can have around that. So, and I appreciate everyone joining today for this conversation. Today, we have Jessica Masterson. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Teaching and Learning on the Vancouver campus. And her research focuses on the various intersections of secondary literacy instruction, youth agency, and democratic education. And what I will say is I've been meeting with the new faculty throughout the year, and I've really enjoyed conversations with Jessica, the questions she asks, and the energy she brings to our meetings, and I'm sure to the department on the Vancouver campus. So Jessica, thank you for being a part of our community. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you to take it away for a research conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Brian, for the invitation. And thank you all so much for attending, especially during your lunch break, what might be the only break you have today. But I'm excited about the time that we're going to spend together. So the title of my talk today is "You Can't Just Throw a Book at Me, Minoritized Students' Experiences of School-Based Literacy Instruction." And just to provide a roadmap of where we're going today, I first want to start with some big animating questions behind my work. Then I want to take us through a couple influential theoretical and empirical perspectives. We'll then talk about a specific study that I did stemming from my dissertation, the findings of those studies, and I'll end just talking about ideas for future research directions. And I'm so excited about this collaborative space because I would love to just kind of bounce ideas off each other. And then of course we'll have open discussion, which will be wonderful. So really broadly, my work focuses on two big questions. First of all, I'm curious about how minoritized youth experience school-based literacy instruction. What is it like? And then secondly, what are the implications of those experiences for literacy researchers, for teachers, and for teacher educators? And I'm a bit of a theory nerd, and I was cutting slides earlier today because I was just thinking I have too much theory. And so I'm going to try to keep it brief, although as you will see, the theories that I'll present to you today have a direct connection to the work that I do. And I'm so excited to talk about them more if anyone is interested. But so in terms of theoretical perspectives, I'm really interested in theories of power and resistance. And for this work specifically, I was really influenced, I suppose, by Louis Althusser, a post-Marxist French scholar, and specifically his writing on ideology, which is a term that many of us in education, many of us who are sort of privy to critical circles, we throw this term around a whole lot. But what I find is that we don't investigate the term, we don't parse it out. It just kind of exists, and we don't actually think too critically about how we can potentially change or alter ideologies. And so Althusser defines ideology as the imaginary relationship of individuals to their real conditions of existence. I just love his positioning of ideology as imaginary. And a huge contribution from him, at least, within the work that I do, is he tried to find and figure out how ideology actually manifests itself in everyday actions. And he says it does. We can see specific actions, we can see practices. These practices form larger rituals. All of that is ideology. He even paraphrases Pascal by saying, "Kneel down, move your lips in prayer, and you shall believe," which is a quote that I really love. And another kind of key piece from his conception of ideology is just that most of us do exactly what we're supposed to do within the ideological frames of our lives. We are good subjects. We'll do the work by ourselves. And in working with students, what I love so much is that we often see, as they're being inculcated into an ideological system, we see them very much resisting and not working all right all by themselves. And I think that might point the way for us in terms of resistance, and I'll talk about that later. But Althusser's view of ideology is very all-encompassing, all-consuming. He says, you know, an individual cannot exist outside of ideology. It's everywhere. So then the question becomes, well, what can we do within it? And to that end, I draw very heavily from the work of Michel de Certeau, another French philosopher, and specifically his concepts on strategies and tactics. So he says the powerful use strategies because the powerful control spaces. We can think about strategies as institutional. So, you know, the space of the classroom, the space of the school building. However, the powerless have tactics, and these are individual. They depend crucially on time. So the powerless don't have very much control over the spaces, but they do have some control over their time. And so he, in his definition of a tactic, he writes, what a tactic wins, it cannot keep. It must vigilantly make use of the cracks that particular conjunctions open in the surveillance of the proprietary powers. It poaches them, it creates surprises in them. It can be where it is least expected. It is a guileful ruse. So tactics, they seize opportunities. They often are disguised as work for another, but they are really work for ourselves or the powerless person in question. And so a third piece, kind of much more contemporary in terms of influential thinking around theories of power, is the work of Ibram Kendi. And what I appreciate so much is that he is naming ideology as an impediment to social change. And in this section here, he's basically saying that we have tried literally for centuries to persuade people into, you know, making structural changes towards equity. We've used moral appeals. We've used logical appeals. We've used education. We've really tried to use education as a way to change society. And it hasn't amounted to enough, right? I think at least we can all agree on that. And so he's saying, if we're rooted in this ideology, and this ideology is fundamentally illogical, we can't change anything unless we're attacking that ideology. So bringing that to literacy, that's kind of another piece of my work here. I think it's important to name that literacy itself is an ideological project. It is tied to power. Access to various forms of literacy is rationed and conscripted. When we think about the US specifically, in my opinion, we can't have a conversation around literacy that doesn't also take into account the history of our democracy and the unequal access to voting that people had, sometimes by virtue of a literacy test, right? And we can't talk about literacy without talking about race. These three pieces, literacy, democracy, race, they are so closely intertwined. So I do want us to be kind of swimming in that pool and thinking about all of these ideas together. And then finally, thinking about school-based literacy, which is, you know, the education that most of us receive, there is a real distinction here between what Patrick Finn calls a domesticating literacy, which is literacy education that is just enough. It allows people to do a little bit of reading, maybe a little bit of writing, and in Finn's words, to not be too troublesome. And that's contrasted with powerful literacy education that allows us to critique issues, that allows us to get close to the Freirean idea of self-actualization, that allows us to see ourselves as producers of knowledge. So again, just kind of thinking about the school context. And moving deeper into the school context, I want to talk specifically about sort of the empirical work, some important empirical work around minoritized youth and what we know about their experiences specifically with literacy in school. So first of all, we know that our minoritized youth are overrepresented within remedial classrooms. And as Brooks and our very own Catherine Rodella have pointed out, youth placements in remedial classes are not race or class neutral practices. And just, I'm now noticing that I didn't define a remedial class, just in case that's something that not all of us are familiar with, but it's essentially a class for students who are not quite at grade level or are behind their peers, generally in the core content area, so reading being one of those. So the fact that these are not race or class neutral practices is really problematic. And we also see that once students are placed in those low track classes, it is really hard to get out. And when they follow the low track path through school, we know that they have reduced opportunities for higher order thinking. We know that they are more exposed to harsh classroom climates. And in general, this corresponds with lower achievement on the whole. Now, the good news is that there is a lot of really compelling research out there that shows us the way forward, a way forward. We know, for instance, when we see students as individuals, when we give them choice, when they have some control over their literacy education, we see them more engaged. We see higher senses of self-efficacy among these students. But still, this hasn't taken hold at a large scale. So within my work, I seek to combat the neutrality of literacy. I think that's kind of first and foremost, in literacy instruction, literacy education, and literacy research. As Elspeth Stuckey says, the neutral stance of literacy educators and researchers is the ideology that literacy research perpetuates, the mask that allows masking to go on. So I see as part of my work the unmasking of these ideologies and these literacy ideologies specifically. So now to turn to the case itself. So I conducted this study again as part of my dissertation. This was data was collected in the fall of 2017, and it took place at what I call Heartland High School, which is in a mid-sized Midwestern city. Over 2,000 students attend the school. Over 30 different languages are spoken within this one school building. And within the Heartland School District, something important to know is that there was a formal reading exam called the Demonstration of Reading Examination, DRE, that students had to pass in order to graduate high school. So it was a formal graduation requirement. And essentially, the students that I worked with, as was the case for many other students, were in remedial classes long before they got to high school. But once they were in high school, the focus was this test. And students had opportunities every semester to take the test. And if they passed, fantastic. And if not, they were re-enrolled in remedial reading the following semester. And there were 4 different reading courses, remedial reading courses. And they were, continual levels of difficulty, starting with reading 1, which was supposed to focus on just literal comprehension. Can you read something and then, tell me the main idea or recall basic facts? Reading 2, which is where I conducted my research, was supposed to focus on inferential comprehension. And by the way, these names were from the district, from Heartland High School, or the Heartland District. This, I'm not projecting my own ideas here. This is what they told me the courses were supposed to be about. So reading 2 is inferential comprehension. So can you infer something based on what you've read? And then reading 3 and 4 were for critical comprehension, which they defined as making connections. So text to text, text to self, text to world connections. And so these were the focuses of these classes. So within this space, I wanted to know a couple of things. First of all, I wanted to know what students in a remedial reading class were learning about the nature of literacy, what is kind of their relationship to literacy based on their compulsory membership in these classes. And then secondly, how might that impact their sense of self, their identity? And so I studied 2 reading 2 classes. It was an ethnographic case study design, which I'm happy to talk more about if anyone has questions. But essentially, I used typical ethnographic data collection methods. So I observed 2 classes twice a week over the course of a semester, so approximately 72 observations. And I conducted 2 rounds of ethnographic interviews with most of the participants. And so, as I said, I had these 2 classrooms in which I was kind of seeking to answer these research questions, and that encompassed 2 teachers and 5 total student participants. Ms. Harper was a novice teacher. She was only in her 2nd year, and she identified as mixed race, white and Cambodian. Within her class, I spoke with her students, Jordan, David, and Gabriella. Jordan was an African-American junior, also the oldest student in my study. So he was a junior and he had taken reading classes since middle school. David was an African-American sophomore, and Gabriella was a bilingual freshman originally from Mexico. In the second class, I observed and interviewed Mr. Baker, who identified as white and was a veteran of remedial reading teaching. He even worked part-time as a curriculum coordinator for the Heartland School District. So he essentially wrote the curriculum that Miss Harper and other reading teachers used. And informally, he served as a mentor to Miss Harper, as someone who had done this a lot. And Miss Harper, again, was only in her second year. And so within Mr. Baker's class, I spoke with Angelica and Guillermo, and they were both bilingual freshmen, and both, like Gabriella, were born in Mexico and immigrated to the US in their elementary school years. So now I'd like to share some major takeaways from this research. First, starting with the nature of the literacy ideology in reading 2. So there were 3 closely connected pillars of the literacy ideology that I identified through my qualitative data analysis. And the first was a profound lack of belief in students' capabilities. And this was evident in the nature of the work given to students, which consisted largely of writing formulas and worksheets. And it was also evident countless times when I witnessed students actively seeking to connect their assigned reading with their lives, their home lives, their interests, only to be told, we're not really working on that right now, or, oh, have you actually finished your worksheet, or, oh, interesting question, but this is what we're doing right now. So as Ms. Harper said, talking about her students, they're in a reading class because they're bad at it, because they don't like it. I have students say that to me sometimes. They say, I don't like reading. It's like, no one in here likes reading. Here we are, all not liking reading together. And so this lack of belief in students' capabilities was, in my mind, tightly linked to what I identified as the autonomous model of literacy that I saw in the curriculum. And this phrase, autonomous model of literacy, this concept rather, comes from Brian Street, who says that within this ideological model of literacy, we tend to treat literacy as a neutral technology and one that proceeds in a specific linear direction, right? One piece after the other. Students, so I saw this again in Mr. Baker's class in a couple of different ways. For instance, I saw students spend half of the semester on learning how to write a 5-sentence summary of a nonfiction article. And they were given sentence frames, graphic organizers, lots of practice with this one task, 5 sentences. And I don't want to knock those particular methods, which can be especially helpful for language learners. But the clear message in reading 2 was, if you haven't mastered this yet, we can't move on to anything else. And in this long quote, and I'm not going to read it, but this is from Mr. Baker, he's basically making the point that he's giving an example that if students don't know their prefixes, you're going to have a hard time engaging them in a literature circle. Like, let's do some work on prefixes first before we have some higher order thinking opportunities. Now, I want to be clear, and I recognize that, you know, perhaps some of us are scoffing at these quotes and perhaps the teachers themselves. And it is not at all my intention to villainize these teachers, both of whom would be the first to tell you that they cared deeply about their students. And Ms. Harper in particular, who identifies herself as a social justice educator. What I see when I go through the data that I collected for the observations, what I see when I read these quotes is really just the seeping in of ideology into these teachers' frame of reference. So I just want to be clear about that. Like, they are part of the ideology too. In fact, they are tasked with carrying it out, reproducing it, right? So I just wanted to be sure that no one accuses this presentation of teacher bashing in any way, especially because their work is so hard. So the third pillar of this literacy ideology is, it's kind of a central deception of sorts. As I mentioned earlier, reading 2 was supposed to focus on that second tier of reading comprehension, that inferential comprehension. And so what I started to do as part of my data analysis, kind of taking a cue from Althusser and the materiality of ideology, I took note of every class activity, every worksheet, every assessment. And then I just grouped them and tried to figure out, okay, how many of these were, literal comprehension, where students are literally just asked to recall basic information, versus inferential comprehension versus critical comprehension. And as you can see, and I know this is pretty small, as you can see here, though, this class that was supposed to be, right, the next level, the inferential comprehension, instead, it was focused mainly on literal comprehension. We never got past this, right? Even though this class was supposed to be about those higher order thinking opportunities. And here I just see, thinking back to Kendi's point about like the illogic of racism, sort of the illogic of ideology often, here we see it, right? Even though they are saying to everybody that, we're proceeding in this linear direction and we're, students learn literal comprehension and they have another class for inferential comprehension, we see that students are just being held back, right? They're stuck at this literal comprehension phase. Okay, so the piece about literacy ideology was important, and I hope it was interesting. But what I was mostly interested in as a researcher was my focal students' reactions and responses to this ideology. So I found that their responses existed along a continuum, running from outright resistance, kind of on the left side of the screen. We have Gabriella saying, "No one can just throw a book at me and tell me to read it. I just have to myself find interest in the book," all the way to submission on the right side of the screen. And there I have a quote from Guillermo, who says, in class, he talks a lot, he says he eats a lot, but then I try to learn a lot. I participate, I raise my hand. He's very interested in submitting, or at least in doing what he's supposed to be doing, being a good subject in Althusser's terms. And then in the middle, and where kind of most students lived, was a space that I have termed, for lack of a better phrase, getting by. And I like this quote from Angelica. It kind of tells you a little bit about this subject position. She says, "Well, right now I'm kind of reading the book, and I say kind of because I'm not reading it, and at the same time I am. Sometimes I'm reading it, but I just don't focus on what it's talking about." So she's kind of in this gray area. And I want to go briefly through each of these subject positions. So with resistance, right, or just kind of outright refusal to comply with the directives of the teacher, it took a lot of different forms. I saw students leave the room. Angelica, for instance, would often leave the room without permission, without warning, often without shoes. Students would also sleep during class. They would listen to music and play games and texts and things on their phones. And this was done brazenly. They weren't trying to kind of disguise it under the desk. They didn't care who saw them do that. Resistance was also vocal at times. So for instance, in this excerpt from Field Notes, Ms. Harper asked if there were any questions about an assignment, and David very loudly says, "Not doing it," and just announces it to his peers. And this was pretty common for David, I would say, too, just this vocal resistance. So then on the other side, right, that submission, this involved completing the work that you were supposed to do, asking questions if you didn't understand, participating, as Guillermo said. But I want to emphasize that this was a fraught space for students to occupy, because it often meant, if you were going to submit to this ideology, you had to accept the social narrative of your own inadequacy, that this was something you were bad at, that was hard for you. And that's hard, right? That's difficult, especially because students don't necessarily see themselves that way. So here's Angelica, I think, kind of speaking to the tenuousness of submitting to this ideology. She says, "I'm a person that if I don't try, I get a really, really low grade. But if I try and I still get a low grade, I'm just like, I tried everything. I put everything I could. And how did I get this grade? I'm a person that doesn't like to give up easily, but sometimes there's times that I'm just like, it's gone, it's over." And so I think in these words, right, we hear that frustration, that conflict, that inner conflict. And then finally, getting by, sort of in the spaces in between resistance and submission, getting by sort of blended submission and resistance in various ways. And it allowed students to work within the structure of the school toward their own ends. It allowed them a little bit of agency within the structure of the school. And students did a variety of things in this sort of gray area of getting by. Guillermo, for instance, would sell candy to his peers because he was saving up money for boxing lessons for himself. So in between activities, he would just, slide people candy and they would give him money. I saw students using their school issued Chromebooks to bid on eBay, to watch Black history documentaries, which I don't necessarily think they were probably watching in any other class, or this is like kind of the only way they could. Students used the bathroom frequently and asked to go to the bathroom constantly throughout both classes. That's a way, a permissible way to leave class. They would often work on their own homework or other classes' homework during reading class. And I have an example on the right side of the screen here from a conversation with David and Ms. Harper. And previous to this conversation, this was actually a conference about his grades, they were supposed to be reading this book, and he sat next to a friend and said, "Hey, tell me what happened." The friend gave him like a very brief summary. And then in his conference with Ms. Harper, she asks him, "Did you read chapter 28? He says, "Yeah." She quizzes him and says, "What happened?" And he said, "She got hit by a car. She's probably gonna die." And that was enough for Ms. Harper. He had taken this one little snippet from a friend and then used it to essentially fool Ms. Harper into thinking that he had actually done the reading when in fact he had not. So as I dug deeper into these data, I began to realize that for students, simply knowing how and when to move among these poles was a form of literacy unto itself. It required a deep familiarity with the structures of the school, as well as the routines of their reading coursework. So to capture this movement, I use the term tactical literacies to refer to the deep fluency of the various structures, routines, and patterns of the reading class that students exhibit. This term also refers to the ways minoritized students are able to read the school or read the classroom itself as a text, right? A sort of fluency. And finally, I borrow the term tactical from Desserteau, who, if you recall, talks about tactics as, sort of the weapons of the oppressed, right? And the focus on stealing time. So students had to compulsorily be in school, occupy the space of the school. But they could steal time for themselves as long as they were in those classes, right? They could watch a documentary, they could do other work, they could leave the classroom, they could sleep. That's a way of using a tactic, way to eat away the class period, if you will. Oops. And I saw many, many examples of this, and I know, again, it's really tiny here, and I'm happy to go over any of these. But I want to name, especially for anyone who's perhaps skeptical out there, that most of these things that I'm talking about would generally be considered like misbehavior by most educators. And I mean, certainly when I was a K-12 educator, I would have seen a lot of these as like off-task behaviors. But I want to state clearly that when we just label these as like simple misbehavior, first of all, we're treating students' agency itself as problematic. And secondly, we are denying the literacy knowledge that minoritized students do have, knowledge that I believe we can leverage in pursuit of academic goals. So as a final insight about tactical literacies, and I promise I'm wrapping up real soon since it's time, I want to humbly suggest that they might paint the way forward for our own work as educators and researchers. So to bring it back a final time to Kendi, he asks us, what if anti-racists constantly self-critiqued our own ideas? What if we blamed our ideologies and methods, studied our ideologies and methods, refined our ideologies and methods again and again until they worked? Anti-racist power must be flexible to match the flexibility of racist power, propelled only by the craving for power to shape policy in its inequitable interests. So in my view, this is work that our minoritized students are already doing. Their literacies, their tactical literacies are flexible, reflective, constantly being refined in classrooms, perhaps across the United States. So maybe we should take a cue from these students and read the institutions and the structures to which we are subject, right? We can find cracks within them. We can seize opportunities that they present us toward equitable ends. So I'll just gloss over these last few slides here. I just wanted to let you know kind of where this work is going. So what I've presented today is really an amalgam of various pieces in a variety of stages of publication. I had a piece come out just a couple months ago in Reading Research Quarterly, which talks about Miss Harper's class specifically. I have a book chapter coming out that deals specifically with the student Angelica and her method of just leaving class with no warning and no note or anything. Much of the work I presented here today is now in its second revision, or actually not technically second. I just finished revisions on this article about submitting, resisting, and getting by for QSE. And I also have a practitioner article coming, well, it's under review right now, hopefully coming out soon, in English Journal. And here I'm thinking about ways to use tactical literacies for classroom research, K-12 classroom research. And in the future, you know, COVID has thrown a wrench in many of our plans, mine too, certainly. So currently I have an ongoing self-study with some master students in my literacies in the disciplines class. And here I'm looking to see if we start off by talking about literacy as ideological, by engaging in sociocultural theories of literacy. Does that at all impact their view of literacy itself and the import of literacy in their content areas? I'm also analyzing some data from a multi-site case study focused specifically on multilingual students' experiences in schools and in language and literacy classes. And then finally, I'm excited to get back into a classroom at some point, and at which point I would really love to explore Finn's idea of a powerful literacy. I want to know where it's happening. I want to, you know, shout it from the rooftops when we find it. And I hope to engage students and teachers in that work. That is what I have for you all today. Thank you so much for listening. I'm excited to hear your thoughts, your questions.
Great, Jessica. That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing your work. It's very, very good to see. And we've already had some comments in the chats by two people. So maybe, I don't know if they want to start or mention that, but let's open up for conversation and questions.
Joy, I'd love to hear more about the engagement framework. If Joy is still here. Oh, okay, thanks, Joy. She just wrote in the chat.
Yeah, perfect.
I'll just say that this work was beautiful. I'm just glad just to be here and listening to it. And when you have presented about that continuum of like how students resist and just get by or they submit, I was like reflecting about my own experiences, like going through K-12 education. And I was just like it was just, so I'm just glad that like you put it to words and like you have theorized it, because like, I just think about the way, so like I had to refuse or resist or submit to like certain types of, I don't say pressures, but like demands by, you know, the institution. And so this was fabulous. I would also just say, I would love to like work with you on something in the future, because I think the work that you're really doing is really powerful and deep. So.
Thanks so much, Amir. That's awesome. I'm glad. I mean, it means a lot that it rang true even in your own individual experience. I feel like, yes, I'm glad to hear that. And yeah, let's work together on anything. Loop me in. I'm here.
I had a question. It's kind of basic. I was just wondering, with the students and their reading materials, were were they chosen by the teacher?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, and it was a little bit more complicated than that because it was a district-wide reading program. So one of the teachers, Mr. Baker, he essentially wrote the curriculum with like 2 or 3 other folks. And every student, you know, in every school, in every high school in the district had that same curriculum. So yeah, and I think they only revisited curriculum for each class because there were 4 different classes, right? Every 7 years. So stuff got pretty stale pretty quick. And also, you know, when you have just a bunch of adults sitting around without any student input, trying to figure out what might be relevant for students.
Just a bad start.
Yes, yes, precisely.
Jessica. Gisela, go ahead.
Oh, thank you, Catherine. I have a quick question regarding the teachers. Did you have a chance to talk with them about what you were observing and providing feedback about what the students were articulating?
Yes, I did. And I while I was doing the study, it wasn't kind of like, hey, I'm noticing this. It was after I had like done the data analysis and had started to put together some major themes. At that point, I reached out, and Mr. Baker didn't respond, and you know, it could have been for a million reasons. He's a busy guy. Miss Harper, though, did, and it was a huge wake-up call for her. And I haven't been in her classroom since, but she hadn't realized that was kind of what was going on. Now, this conversation that we had wasn't formalized, it wasn't built into the study, and I see that as an important piece to build in future studies, right? But yeah, to answer your question, I did reach out and share this information with them.
Well, I was gonna say, this is really, I agree with Amir. How do you have just theorize and put it in a way that I think many people will understand what is happening right now in classrooms, how we're creating this pipeline that starts early on when kids start having a little problem here and there, and then it just traverses throughout the whole education. So thank you so much for doing that.
Thank you, Gisela. Yeah, I'm hopeful. I mean, I would love also, since this is a research conversation too, if there are thoughts about, you know, how to present this to interested parties, which parts, if any, were particularly useful. I mean, in my own view, even just kind of mapping out like all the activities that they did and just seeing from that, like, oh, we're actually keeping students in this literal comprehension area, you know, when they're supposed to be moving on. I mean, I think even something like that might be a helpful artifact to bring to, you know, a meeting with administrators and stakeholders.
I wanted to add in, and it's kind of building off Gisela's question. First, I think it's incredible, and this is not my area, even if I was a co-author on my friend's publication years ago. But to me, thinking about student voice, and I love that student was, I love it when they were misbehaving. I mean, not that, like, you know, I know it's like good, because I was a high school teacher too, and it was terrible, but I think about the idea of like, now, like, thinking about the implications for teachers, right? So thinking about what it means, then how are those examples of the students' creativity and like they were figuring out how to survive in an environment they were being controlled in, right? So how do you think through working with pre-service teachers now, you know, and sharing this and like thinking about how they can think about classroom management and reset that? I wonder if you've thought about kind of that, because I love it, but I also see the tension, and you voiced it. So I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit when it comes to working with teachers.
Yeah, Catherine, that's such a great question. And I have no answers. I mean, honestly, what I do in terms of my own work with pre-service teachers is I share vignettes from my research. We talk a lot about how to build in student choice, student voice. I mean, I literally, when you're talking about kind of, you know, students misbehaving, the piece in Reading Research Quarterly actually opens with this vignette in which I saw a student of color who, and both, by the way, in both of these classes, students of color and multilingual students made up the majority, even though that was not the case within the school, right? And that's just, again, what we see nationwide. But she was supposed to be reading this book called The Warrior's Heart by Eric Greitens, the now disgraced like former governor of Missouri. I was like, it's his memoir. That's what she was supposed to be reading. That was the curriculum choice. And she had, you know, she did the classic, like where you have one book here and then you open up another book in the middle. Like she had Sherman Alexi's Flight in the middle and was just like sitting in the class, just be like, I love this book, and just going kind of wild. And finally, Miss Harper realized, because again, no one else was saying, I love this book about the warrior's heart. Miss Harper realized like, oh, she's reading, but she's not supposed to be reading that. And I just thought that was such, you know, that's just a really profound metaphor for the class itself. She's not doing the right kind of reading. But I guess to kind of like circle back to your question, I mean, there's what I see as one of the major tensions in teacher education right now. And, you know, it's not just me saying it, this isn't my brilliant idea. We all have experienced it. Is that we prepare students for a school system that just isn't it. It does not exist, right? And so we prepare them to write their own curriculum, with which more and more of our teachers aren't able to do. We, you know, tell them all of these cool strategies and approaches, and you know, we're talking about YPAR with one of my classes right now. And it's hard because I know it's very likely that they will enter school districts where they can't do YPAR, or if they do, they have to fit it in. They have to be tactical, right? And I think that's kind of where maybe this research can point the way forward. I mean, I look to the students and I see that they can teach us a whole lot, right? Let's take a cue from them. So, you know, and it has made me reflect, like, you know, I'm part of this institution, and my institution expects a lot of me. Wonderful. Are there ways that I can work within the system towards equitable ends, right? And I wonder if that's a direction for teacher education, preparing students to be a little tactical with their work, with their teaching.
Go ahead, Sarah.
I was just gonna say this. This reminds me a lot of science too. I know that people have been making connections across disciplines, so I'll just throw in some science connections too. Because I think a lot of times when we're in remedial science classes, we're focused on the facts and the content, and they can't do science processes and engage in practices because they misbehave when we do that. But if we start with questions that are authentic to the students, then, you know, then they're more likely to be interested in what we're doing rather than engaging students in abstract concepts that are just the list of concepts that have to be covered today. And so I think, like, building off of what you're talking about, when I work with pre-service teachers, I help them to take existing curriculum materials and then think about how can I revise this and edit it to be better and more in line with what their students have experience with and knowledge of and questions about. Which I'm not trying to like toot my own horn. I just think that I think that this is a really nice connection in that it provides further evidence for the problem isn't the students, the problem is our connection to our students and thinking about how can we build that across subject areas. So I really enjoyed this.
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you so much for coming. Yeah, I was, you know, I taught 7th and 8th grade in Hawaii, and one year I read chapter 2 of Pedagogy of the Oppressed with my 8th graders. It took a long time to kind of get through it. But in the discussions that followed, a student brought up science specifically and was like, we are told that, you know, we can't do fun stuff because we can't even handle writing notes. But it's like, writing notes is boring, right? And to me, that's such an example of the illogic of this ideology, right? Well, unless you are able to sit quietly and copy all these notes from endless PowerPoints, then how, you know, I can't trust you to do, you know, a project-based learning, you know, assignment, or we can't do experiments, or we can't go outside and observe the natural world. And again, just that illogic of ideology is so clear.
Jessica, this gets back, first off, I love this presentation. This is really good, lots to think about. In terms of reactions that you might get, one reaction that I had, and maybe you can talk me out of this, it was sort of pessimistic.
Yeah.
And the reason I say that is because your use of the terms tactics and strategies and the power inherent in it, you really made that clear. And if you talk to, like, you know, military people, they say you can never win a war if you just use tactics. And so if you don't have control of the strategy, there's no way of overcoming this. And so it gets back to Freire a little bit too. So I'm in a pessimistic space right now. I don't know if you can or want to talk me out of it, but that was a reaction that I had.
Yeah, Dave, I'm so glad that you brought it up. I mean, first of all, right, I totally get that, you know, kind of borrowing metaphors from the realm of war is questionable, right? That positions, you know, students and teachers and adults, right, as kind of like on opposite warring sides. And perhaps that's not a helpful framework. So I'm open to kind of thinking more about that, but also about tactics. Yeah, Dissertot says, I mean, the first thing he says is what they win, they cannot keep, right? They're fleeting, they're opportunities seized on the wings. So I don't see tactics as like a solution, especially kind of encountering this like rigid, powerful ideology. But I'm wondering if they might help us bridge the gap between, like, you know, taking down all the structures tomorrow and where we are right now. So the piece that I put out for English Journal, which is looking at like tactical literacies in a classroom, I'm seeing them as a way, like with students, with K-12 students, to open up conversations about the literacies that they do have, because again, often so many times these students are told they're in these remedial reading classes because they can't read, right? They don't like it, they're not good at it. So I'm looking at kind of that as a way to open up a conversation. Like, how are we able to read our lives? How are we able to read the various spaces that we inhabit? How do we move through them in a way that allows us to retain some agency? And I see from those conversations, then perhaps the next step is like, you know, I kind of imagine this classroom in which students are mapping, or perhaps collecting their own data, an autoethnographic project, perhaps, sharing it with each other, and then like organizing for action, right? Organizing to take on the strategic power of the institution. So I don't know, again, I don't know if that brings you out of that pessimistic space, but that's my thinking as of yet.
That's great, Jessica. Thanks. I see we have about 2 minutes left, so we'll see if there's one or two more comments. I want to make one comment. You know, that what I really love about this work, it's tying to some of the stuff we're doing and trying to look at tests and bias and tests. And your quote about blame the methods and keep trying to find methods until they work, which means we're always blaming them, which means we never have perfect methods. I love the uncertainty that's brought into this. Makes me think about your continuum that someone else mentioned, and the space to explore for me is not, you know, what you're seeing as individual. You know, I think of individuals coming to this situation with characteristics of themselves, and you're showing that continuum. But to me, there's this whole other space to look at also of what are the characteristics of the environment that also those students have with them, including their family environment, their neighborhood environment, and so forth, because that is influencing how they're falling on that continuum when you're looking inside the classroom. So I think about methods of how we go about and try to explore or expand that space. And we're doing that in some of our work in a quantitative realm, but in this way, I'm trying to think about what is, you know, how do you capture that influence as well? So I just want to throw that out there, but I love that quote, so thank you.
Yeah. No, thanks so much, Brian. Yes, we should talk more about this. I'm very interested. Of course, yeah, I didn't really delve into students' like environmental lives, their, you know, their home lives and things like that, which of course, like, we can't separate out, right, from their behaviors, from their reactions to the class. So I'd love to, I'll be chewing on this for a while.
Great. It looks like we are at time. I want to thank you so much. This was wonderful to share your work with us. Very inspirational, and we see a path forward, so it's wonderful. And I love the conversation that we've had with everyone today, so thank you. What I will remind you is we will post this on our site, so you can revisit the conversation. I put the link in the chat. And we will have our next presentation on Wednesday, April 7th, same time, 12:10 to 1. And that will be Jeff Walls, who's here today. Hi, Jeff. and he's up in Spokane, and we look forward to having him with us for that 50 minutes for our conversation. So thank you, everyone, and thank you very much, Jessica.
Thank you all so much for your time.